Taming the High Cost of College, Episode 12.
You have kids, they grow up, and before you know it, it's time to plan for college.
Where do you start?
How much is it going to cost?
Will you qualify for financial aid?
Should you be looking into scholarships?
When will you be able to retire?
What about student loans?
The list of questions is never ending. The good news is, all the answers are right here. Welcome to the Taming the High Cost of College podcast. Here is your host, certified financial planner, Brad Baldridge.
Hello, and welcome to Taming the High Cost of College. I'm your host, Brad Baldridge, and today we're going to spend some time talking about saving and investing for college. We've got a quick question about filling out the FAFSA and what to do about taxes that aren't yet done. And finally, I'm going to recommend another podcast that is a great podcast about college planning that you can listen to in addition to this one if you're looking for some additional material and insight into college. Now, as we move into the main segment here and we talk about saving and investing for college, I just want to reiterate that this is not advice specific to you. In other words, please don't run off and make a decision based on what you hear today. Do your due diligence and make sure you understand the tax rules or talk to a qualified tax advisor. Make sure you understand how the investments are going to work or talk to a qualified investment counselor. Spend the time and effort to understand or hire professionals or work with somebody that can provide you quality legal, tax, and investment advice. So everything we talk about, I believe to be accurate, but please, there's a lot of exceptions to all the rules that we talked about, and there's a lot of times when you might want to be doing something different because of something that's a little bit unique in your situation compared to most people. With that, we're going to now move into the core segment, and we're going to talk about how to invest for college. Today, we're going to talk about the various ways that you can save or invest money for your kids' future college expenses. I get the question all the time, well, what's better? Putting money in the bank or putting money in a 529? Or what's better, putting it in this investment or that investment? And the right answer is, it depends. It depends on your overall college planning situation, and it depends on, I guess, two key areas for sure, and probably many more beyond that. But the two key areas that you really need to understand to help you get your arms around where investing or saving money was going to make sense for you is one is your tax situation. Are you in a relatively high tax bracket? Is your income high and therefore your tax bill high? Are you also potentially dealing with AMT or alternative minimum tax? That may change how the tax benefits affect you as well. So that's the first question, is how much do you actually pay in taxes? What tax bracket are you in? Are taxes a problem? And the other area you need to understand is need-based financial aid. Are you going to qualify for need-based aid? Are you going to qualify for a lot of need-based aid or no need-based aid at all? And I guess more important than that is, when will you qualify for need-based aid? For a lot of families, you can qualify sometimes when you only have one student. Sometimes you qualify when you have two in school, but not one. So we've talked about that in some other podcasts, but you need to understand, do I qualify for need-based aid? Because sometimes having investments and money in the bank and that type of thing will be counted against you, and it could reduce your financial aid. Now, some of you are out there are what I would call type 3 families, which means your income and your assets are high enough that you are not going to qualify for need-based aid, and there's nothing you can do to make it any better. So no matter what you do, you will not qualify for need-based aid. If that's the case, then looking at the tax benefits and other opportunities makes a lot of sense, and you can ignore the fact that some of these types of investments would mess up need-based aid because you're not going to get any need-based aid, so you have nothing to mess up. So I'm going to cover, looks like about 6 or 7 different areas. Money in the bank, investments such as mutual funds, stocks, and bonds. We're going to talk about the Roth IRA, the traditional IRA, your retirement plans at work, whether it's a 401k or a 403b, and then the two savings plans that are focused specifically on college, which would be the 529 and the Coverdell. So let's get started. So the first thing I want to talk about is money in the bank. From a tax perspective, you don't get a lot of tax benefits. If the money grows in the bank, which is be relatively unlikely in today's interest environment, but if you receive a little bit of interest, you're going to have to pay taxes on it when you receive it. There's no real benefit to that. And for financial aid purposes, you're going to have to report it. Now, one of the things to be cautious about when you have money in the bank is, whose money is it? Some bank accounts will be mom and dad's money, and perhaps the student will have access to it. And sometimes it's the student's money, and perhaps mom and dad have access to it, or they don't. I always encourage families to understand, well, whose asset are you going to have to report that as? As a rule of thumb, I say, well, whose social security number is on that account and who's going to pay the taxes on that account? And I would encourage people, especially when it comes to need-based aid again, if bank accounts are in your student's name, that will hurt you a lot more than if the bank account is in mom and dad's name. So if you have bank accounts, I would verify that it's primarily in mom or dad's name, and perhaps the student has access to it so that they can continue to use their debit card to give access to their money and that type of thing. But it's primarily a parent asset. Then we have mutual funds, stocks, and bonds. You can own mutual funds, stocks, and bonds for college. Whatever type of investment they are determines how you pay taxes. But if you have stocks or bonds that are earning and growing, you may have to pay taxes on dividends or taxes on capital gains or finally taxes on interest payments. But all of these types of investments may be a good choice for investing for college because now you have the opportunity, at least, for more growth than you might have in the bank. You also, of course, have more opportunity for the investments to go down than what you have in the bank. So it's kind of a give and take as to whether or not you want to take the additional risks for the additional reward. So as far as taxes are concerned, somebody's going to have to pay the taxes. Again, these types of accounts can be in mom and dad's name and often are, but they could also be in the student's name. Now, most of the time for investments of this sort, in order for it to be actually in the student's name, you need to set up an account which is called an UGMA or an UTMA, UGMA or UTMA. If you own those types of accounts and you have mutual funds or stocks within the account, then technically those accounts are owned by the student. And we'll talk more about the UGMA and UTMA a little bit later. But as far as having mutual funds or stocks or bonds, how does that impact financial aid? Again, owning them outright, not inside a retirement plan, would be an asset that you're going to have to report for financial aid purposes. If you own 100 shares of IBM and it's worth $100 a share, that means you have a $10,000 asset that you will need to report when you fill out financial aid. If IBM creates a dividend, it's also going to create a little bit more income for you. You're going to have to pay taxes on that dividend, and that dividend is going to show up on your financial aid forms as well because it'll increase your income. So having large amounts of mutual funds or stocks or bonds from a financial aid perspective is often detrimental. Instead of having 10,000 in stock, what if you had 100,000 or $1 million in stock? If you owned it directly, you may have an opportunity to mess up your financial aid. There was a local business here in town that was employee owned, and the employees of that business had large amounts of stock. And those employees, unfortunately, although it worked well for their own retirement because they were loaned money and were able to build up a quite a strong net worth, often hundreds of thousands of dollars within that company stock. Unfortunately, for college purposes, they needed to report that as an asset. And a couple $100,000 in stock was very detrimental to financial aid, especially if you could compare that to another opportunity where maybe they could have had that same investment, but inside a 401k instead, where it would not have been reported. So owning individual mutual funds or owning stocks or bonds or brokerage accounts, all those types of accounts need to be reported. The big advantage to them, however, is you can take that money out and use it whenever you want. You may have to pay taxes again, but there's no restriction as to what you spend the money on. There's no restriction as to when you can take the money. There's no 59.5 rule. So you have a lot of access to that money. And the growth opportunities and risks are there as well. Another opportunity would be to own those same stocks, bonds, or mutual funds, and typically it would be mutual funds now, within some other type of account. So now we have the opportunity for growth and or reduction in growth or losses is, let's say we own mutual funds, but we could own that within the other accounts that we've talked about. The Roth IRA, the 401k, the 529, a Coverdale, or a UTMA or UGMA account. I often get the question, well, what is the rate of return of a 529? And 529s do not have a rate of return. The investment that you put inside your 529 determines the rate of return. So you can have 529s or IRAs or Roth IRAs, all the same, all work the same. They all have a rate of return based on the underlying investment. So the 529s, 401ks, Roths, all those types of things could be invested in mutual funds, and they would get mutual fund-like returns. They could be invested in a fixed account or a bank account type of account where you get a guaranteed 1% interest or something like that. So the rate of return is dependent on the investment choice that you make, but there's an extra layer around these investments. So let's talk a little bit about the Roth IRA. The Roth IRA is designed for retirement primarily. So with a Roth IRA, you put the money in, you do not get to any deductions for it. So if you have $5,000 left over from your earnings that year and you contribute to a Roth IRA, it's not going to help you at all for tax purposes. Once the money is in the Roth IRA, it grows tax deferred, and if you follow the right rules, you can take it out tax free. So the right rules for most people is you need to hold on to it at least 5 years or until you're 59 and a half, whichever is longer. And if you can do that, then you will not have to pay taxes on the withdrawal. Now, there's some exceptions as well where you can take your money earlier. For the Roth IRA, you can withdraw your contributions at any time for any reason, and you won't have to pay taxes on that either. So let's say you put in $5,000. 5 years later, it's now worth $7,000 because it grew, and you're not yet 59 and a half. You could take out your original $5,000 contribution and spend it on college, or anything else for that matter. You could spend it on a vacation and not have to pay taxes on that withdrawal. The growth part of the money, if you want to take out the $2,000 of growth in addition to the $5,000, you will have to pay taxes and possibly penalties on that amount of money. So you want to understand that you get some tax benefits for the Roth IRA, but you also potentially have your money tied up a little bit more because of the 59 and a half rules and so forth. What's interesting about the Roth is you can make a contribution for the previous year. So you have until tax time or April 15th to make a contribution for the previous year. And in January, February, March, and April, you could actually make a contribution for the current year and the previous year. So how are Roths treated when it comes to financial aid? The answer is very well. The money that you put into the Roth IRA, as you put it in, doesn't really have an impact on your taxes and therefore does not have an impact on your financial aid either, but it is not reported as an asset. So it's not unusual when I'm counseling people to have them open a Roth IRA for mom and dad and put in $5,500 for mom, $5,500 for dad for last year, and another $5,500 for this year, especially in the January, February timeframe. So you can shift $20,000 and it will not show up for financial aid purposes. Now, of course, the challenge is you have rules now as far as getting the money back out. So if this is money you intend to spend on college, you need to understand the withdrawal provisions. But generally speaking, Roth IRAs work pretty well as far as financial aid is concerned because they are not an asset for the federal system. Now, if you do the CSS profile, and again, if you're not familiar with what that is, I cover that in some other podcasts, but if you have to do the CSS profile, which is used at some of the larger private schools and the more expensive private schools, they will ask about what you have inside your retirement plans. But to my knowledge, there's not a college out there that would actually count those assets against you. Now, if you had multi-million-dollar Roth IRAs, they might count it against you. But again, for the typical family, most colleges that I'm aware of will exclude any retirement assets like a Roth IRA. Next, we have the traditional IRA. The traditional IRA is an IRA where you potentially would be able to deduct your contributions in the year that you make them. The way that you might have assets in a traditional IRA is if you have from previous jobs or pensions able to roll over money from your old 401ks and those types of things to deposit them into an IRA. You do have access to taking money from your IRA for college before 59 and a half. And once you're older than 59 and a half, you can take out the money again for any reason, spend it on college, spend it on retirement, spend it on a vacation. There's an exception to the rules that says you can take money out prior to 59 and a half if you spend it on qualified education expenses. Now, there's a number of rules, and I'm not going to get into the details of it. Just be aware that you could take your IRA if you needed it for college expenses and avoid the penalties. You're still going to have to pay the taxes, but you might be able to avoid the 10% federal penalty and the corresponding state penalty if your state imposes one. The challenge also, though, is if you take money out of an IRA, it's going to increase your income that year. And next year, when you fill out your financial aid forms, your income is going to be that much higher and make it more difficult to qualify for aid. So from a financial aid perspective, using money for college out of your IRAs often messes things up in the long term, in the big picture. So very seldom are we actually putting money into an IRA on purpose, knowing that we're going to be using it for college. Sometimes it's a safety valve saying, well, if all else fails, we could tap into our IRA, but that's not our goal. So IRAs, you do have a little bit of access to your money, but again, they're not a great vehicle for intentionally putting college money into them. And there is a little bit of a provision to take money out if you absolutely needed to. Next, we have your retirement plan at work. It could be a 401k, a 403b, a 401c, and there's a number of different plans available at work that people may have. Now, oftentimes these plans also have a 59.5 rule, and if you're actually working at the company and contributing, you may not have very good access to that money. From a tax perspective, they may work very well. Again, a strategy that I've used when it comes to saving and investing for families is if you have a lot of outside assets. Let's say you'd had that $100,000 of stock in IBM and you're saying, well, I need to liquidate and shelter this money. I don't really need it. It's for retirement, and it's messing up my financial aid. What I've had families do is, especially if you start early, if you have a sophomore in college, you've got a couple of years till you're going to be actually at college and dealing with financial aid. In those years, you would spend the money from the IBM and max out your 401k contributions. So for a lot of families, if you max out your 401k, maybe you could put in $20,000 or $30,000 of extra money that you normally would not have contributed. Now, for many families, you say, well, wait a minute. If I put an extra $30,000 into my retirement, now I'm short $20,000 or $30,000 to pay my living expenses. So then what you would do is if you had those outside assets, money in the bank, or say that IBM stock again, you could liquidate that money and spend it. And it's the equivalent of taking the money from the stock and putting it into your 401k. You just need to do it through a payroll deduction. So it's kind of a two-step process. But again, sometimes it makes sense for families to max out their retirement contributions for a couple of reasons. One is it might bring your income down and therefore your taxes down, and make you qualify for things like college tax deductions and other things that you may not qualify otherwise. And the other reason you may want to do it is because it helps you. Any assets in a 401k generally do not count when it comes to financial aid again. So having $100,000 inside your 401k is much better than having $100,000 outside your 401k, as an example. I need to remind you that if you are a type 3 family and you will not qualify for any sort of need-based aid, some of these things that we're talking about don't really matter. Because again, if you're not going to get need-based aid, there's no reason to hide all your money in a 401k because you're not going to be able to get financial aid anyway. But for a lot of families, it can make a difference. So that's the financial aid. From a tax perspective, it reduces your taxable income in the year that you do it, and it grows tax deferred. And when you take it out to spend it, you then have to pay the taxes. In my personal situation, I'm currently 46 and my youngest daughter is 7. So when she's in college and she's, say, 15 years from now, I'm 46, I'll be 61, I will have access to my retirement plans. So I could put money in my 401k or my IRA knowing that the very tail end of my college situation, I would be 59 and a half and have access for the last few years of my youngest daughter's college. So it may make sense in that perspective. And I've had a number of families where mom or dad are in their late 50s, and we can use their 401ks knowing that we'll be 59 and a half and have access to them in the future. And there's also, just so you're aware, at some 401ks have a provision, and 403bs have a provision that allows, if you retire from your place of employment that had the 401k, you may actually have access to that 401k at age 55 instead of 59 and a half. So again, a loophole that a lot of people aren't aware of, but you may have access even earlier if it's the 401k that you separate service from and you're older than 55 when you separate. So there's a lot of, again, hoops. So if you need details on that, consult with your investment advisor, consult with your tax advisor, make sure you understand all the ins and outs. But again, another opportunity. So let me give you an example where a 401k was very useful. I had a family who were not quite eligible for the American Opportunity Credit. Their income was $180,000 or so. And to be eligible for the full credit, your income needs to be $160,000. So between mom and dad, they were earning about $180,000, and we needed to bring that down to $160,000. So we were able to plan ahead, and we knew this was coming. So we actually increased their 401k contributions so that their income the next year was going to be at about $160,000. Now, by doing that, we actually reduced their actual taxes, both federal and state. So that saved them about $7,000 in taxes, normal taxes. In addition to that, they had 2 kids in college, so they were able to take the opportunity credit twice, and that's another $5,000. So they put away $20,000. They got about $12,000 back on their taxes. And then what we did is we borrowed the money out of the 401k. So we had access to the money anyway, and we spent it on current college bills. So in that situation, it worked well. We were able to have our cake and eat it too, but you really need to understand where the lines are and how all the taxes work out. All right, next I'm going to talk about the 3 accounts that are commonly used specifically for college. So we've got the 529s, the Coverdell, and the UTMA or UGMA. So what is a 529? Well, a 529 is a specific program set up by each state in the country to save for college. And there's a lot of good tax benefits for 529s. The rules essentially say that if you put money into a 529, it will grow tax deferred, and if you take it out and spend it on college properly, all the growth will be tax-free. Now, generally you don't get a federal deduction for putting it in like you would for your retirement plan. But let's say you put $3,000 into a 529, and a couple years later it's now college time and your $3,000 is now worth $4,000. If you spend that entire $4,000 on qualified education expenses, which usually isn't that difficult with the price of college these days, but you make sure you spend it on qualified expenses, then the entire $4,000 is tax-free, and the $1,000 of growth that you would have had to pay taxes on if you did it in a mutual fund or in the bank or in other places is completely avoided. Right now, there are no income limits or other rules as far as who can contribute to a 529. So I see a lot of 529s working very well for grandmas and grandpas, for mom and dads that are relatively high income and can benefit from the tax benefits. So what is the big disadvantage to 529s? Well, that would be how they're treated for financial aid. Generally speaking, 529s are going to be a parent asset because generally 529s are owned. Mom and dad owns the 529 for the benefit of little Johnny or for the benefit of little Susie. The challenge is for financial aid, you need to report all of your 529s. So in a family with 3 kids, and you have $30,000 set aside for each kid, you have a total of $90,000 in assets that you're going to have to report when you fill out your financial aid. So it's going to be the assets for all the kids, not just the current student in college. So 529s, although they offer great tax benefits, can have an impact on financial aid. Another benefit to 529s is some of the states that sponsor 529s offer state tax benefits to participate in their plan. So as an example, here in Wisconsin, if you contribute to a 529, the first $3,000 you contribute per beneficiary, you're able to deduct that contribution from your Wisconsin state income taxes. Most people here in Wisconsin pay about 6.5% state taxes. So if you contribute $3,000 for one student, that'll save you around $190, $200 in state taxes for that family. Now, if you have multiple kids, you could do $3,000 per kid and increase your opportunities to save on the state side of things. Now remember, the 529s have the opportunity to invest aggressively, but they also have the opportunity to invest very conservatively. So 529s may make sense for young kids where the college is a long ways away, and 529s may make sense for older kids, even seniors or currently in college students where you say, well, I'm going to put money in the 529 today and I'm going to take it out a year from now or 2 years from now when college is happening. And again, you may get some tax deferred or tax-free growth. You may get some small tax deductions for doing the contributions. There's no income limits. So if your income is relatively high, there's a lot of other things you do not qualify for. So then 529s may be an opportunity to get some tax benefits. The disadvantage is to get those tax benefits, you have to spend the money on qualified education expenses. So qualified education expenses would be tuition, room and board, some fees, often books, and a computer if it's required by the college. If you spend the money on other things like travel or vacations, you're going to have to pay penalties to have access to your own money. So it is possible to have too much money in a 529 because you may have more money in the 529 than you have qualified education expenses. Now, another concern that people have is, well, what if my student doesn't go to college? Or what if my student wins a big scholarship? If that happens, you do have the opportunity to change beneficiaries on 529s. So if you set up a 529 for little Johnny and little Susie while they're young and you didn't know, but you discover that little Johnny ultimately doesn't go to college, you could transfer the 529 in little Johnny's name to little Susie and spend it there instead. Now, let's say little Johnny turns out to be a phenomenal student and he wins a full ride somewhere. And you're saying, well, I don't have any qualified education expenses now because we won scholarships for the entire cost of college. That would be a great problem to have. And as far as the 529 is concerned, they will allow you to take money out up to the amount of the scholarships without having to pay any penalties. Now, you're still going to have to pay taxes on the growth, but again, it's another safety valve where you're able to take the money out and avoid penalties because of the scholarships. But again, 529s do count against you for financial aid. And all the 529s that you have. So you may need to use them sparingly or strategically depending on where you fit in the financial aid puzzle. Next, we have the Coverdell. Coverdell used to be called the Education IRA, and a long time ago it was limited to $500, so most families never bothered. The current limit is $2,000 that you can contribute each year, and so now it's more likely that you would use it. The big difference between the Coverdell and the 529 is the Coverdell can be used for K through 12 education, so you could spend it on a private high school, you could use it for private grade school, so there's a little more uses for it, but there's also an income limit where you cannot contribute to a Coverdell if your income, and I believe it's $110,000 single or $220,000 married at this point. But if your income is at a certain level, the Coverdell is not available to you anymore. Coverdell is a lot less popular now that the 529s have come out, and the 529 does not have an income limit, nor does it have a contribution limit. Well, it does, but it's a very high limit. Most 529 limits are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So the maximum contribution to a 529, depending on the state and so forth, might be $230,000, or which is essentially an estimate of what the most expensive school might cost currently for 4 years. The last area I want to cover is the UTMA. The UTMA or UGMA or the UTMA or UGMA is an account that we mentioned a little bit earlier, but that is how you would actually be able to have a mutual fund or a stock or a bond invested in your student's name on purpose. A lot of stockbrokers and investment professionals encourage people to put money into UTMAs for college because you get some tax benefits. Because if the account grows, the taxes are generally paid by the student and not the parent. Unfortunately, we have new rules, which are called the kiddie tax rules, that say that oftentimes a student is going to pay the same tax rate as mom and dad. So the tax benefit, because of the tax law changes, has diminished quite a bit. But there's a lot of UTMAs and UGMAs still out there. And you can tell if you have them by looking at the actual registration on the investment paperwork, where it will typically say something like UTMA, Mama Smith for the benefit of Baby Smith. And that's how you would know that Mama's in charge, but Baby is the beneficiary, and technically it's Baby's money. As far as financial aid is concerned, this is considered a student asset. So in some of my other podcasts, you may have learned that money in the student's name is assessed the most heavily, and you'd rather have the money in mom and dad's name most of the time. Again, if you qualify for need-based aid. So again, often I am working with families to try and spend and use the UTMA money before we ultimately get to college, because it may have made sense when you put it in there 5, 10, 20 years ago, but in a lot of cases, it's getting in the way now. So having money in the student's name, how do you take care of that? What can you do with money that's in the student's name? Well, the obvious answer is spend it. But the rules state that you have to spend it for the student's benefit. In other words, you could not take your son's UTMA money and mom and dad go to Vegas with it and use it up that way. Technically, you're supposed to spend that money for the benefit of the student. So the student could go to Vegas with it if the custodian approved, and often that's mom and dad making those decisions. But you could also spend it on a lot of other things like their high school tuition or high school fees, their football fees, their music fees, their cell phone, their blue jeans, all the various expenses. You know, when they go to prom, they spend their own money. Now, typically that might have been mom and dad's money that they would have spent had they not had the UTMA. So let's say you're about to go on a family vacation. The kids buy their own tickets with their own money, which saves mom and dad $1,000. And then mom and dad take that $1,000 and they put it into some other college investment. So it's just a way to use up UTMA money so that it's used up before you have to report it for college. So those are the main categories again. I realize this was very content dense, so I will try and put together good notes on the website as far as all the details that we've talked about here. You can get that at tamingthehighcofcollege.com/13, which would be, this is the 13th episode. If you have any questions or comments about this, or you have questions, please feel free to give us a call or send us an email with your questions. You can also send a question via the recording feature at our website. Hopefully this is helpful, and we're going to now move on to a quick question that I've gotten 2 or 3 times recently. So let's move on to questions.
Have a question? Brad is accepting questions from his listeners now. Record a question at tamingthehighcostofcollege.com and get it answered on one of the future episodes.
All right, the question I want to answer today, and I heard this question a couple times over the phone with a couple people that called with needing some help. So the question is, we're trying to figure out how to fill out the FAFSA, and we do not have our taxes done yet. So what should we do? Do we have to fill out the FAFSA? Can we wait for taxes? What do you recommend? And what I recommend and what I always tell people is you want to fill out your financial aid forms and get them submitted and meet any deadline that you have to deal with colleges. So a lot of colleges are going to have a February 1st, March 1st, April 1st, somewhere in that neighborhood of a deadline. So whatever the earliest deadline for your colleges is, that's the date you need to target. And if you cannot get your taxes done, you want to use estimates. So how do we do that? Well, for a lot of people, it's really simple. You just use essentially last year's taxes because this year and last year aren't all that different. Your salaries were the same. Your deductions were the same. Your, gifts to charity were pretty much the same. And that's a good first estimate. And it'll be close enough for what you're trying to do. Now, for a lot of people out there, it may not be that simple because this year's taxes, the ones that you need to fill out financial aid, may be radically different than the prior year. So if you work on commission, let's say, so your income varies, or you own a business and your income varies, or you change jobs, so you've got some unusual circumstances where you say, you know what, my salary was up or down because of changes in employment or because of changes in my business or whatever it might be. Well, then what I tell people to do is to make a photocopy of last year's taxes and then get a red pen and just start altering last year's taxes with whatever current information that you know is appropriate. So if you know, and maybe you already have your W-2s or you can run a year-to-date on your business or whatever it is, and you say, all right, well, I know last year my salary was $90,000, but this year it was $120 because I've got a raise. Well, you cross off the 90, you write in $120. And if you know that you had a big capital gain, or if you know that, I didn't take money out of an IRA this year, so this number goes away, and you just step through your taxes and you do the best you can in adjusting each number. And then you can do a real quick calculation and figure out what your AGI is. And then once you have your AGI, you can, again, guesstimate what your deductions will be for the year. And if you don't know, use last year's numbers again. And then once you finally have your taxable income, you can look up on a tax table and do a pretty simple calculation and calculate what your taxes are. Because for financial aid, the questions that they're going to ask you are, what was each worker's income? What did mom earn from work? What did dad earn from work? They're also going to ask you what your AGI was, which is the bottom of the first page of a 1040. And they're going to ask you what your total tax was. So once you have those numbers calculated, that's a good place to start and estimate your FAFSA numbers and just do the best you can. And if you're going to err, you say, well, I'm not sure. I guess my general recommendation is be a little bit low instead of a little bit high. So if you saying I'm not sure, it's somewhere between 75 and 80, use 75. If it later comes back and it is 80, you're going to have the opportunity to correct the FAFSA and resubmit it. But you'd rather go in low and adjust it slightly up than to go in high and have to adjust it down. Because if you go in high, they may not give you the aid. And when you correct things, now you're eligible, but because you're much later now, the aid might be gone. Versus if you go in too low and you correct things, they might say, oh, well, based on your corrections, we're going to take some of the aid away. But at least you have the aid, most of the aid, and they only take half of it away. If it's the other way around and they give you no aid and now you're eligible and it's gone, you may get nothing. So again, you want to be close as you can be, reasonably be. And again, we're talking, round things to the nearest $1,000 and use your estimates that way. So that's my recommendation. I help people with that quite often where we're saying, well, this is how things have changed. Once you have those numbers, you can put them on the FAFSA. When you fill out the FAFSA, you're going to check the box that says has not filed. And then further into the process, when you have more details, then you'll be able to put in the perfect answers and resubmit the FAFSA. So all the colleges will get the exact updated numbers. But it helps the colleges to have a preliminary set of numbers so that they can start figuring out approximately what you might be eligible for and work from there. So hopefully this helps. And if you have questions on this, let me know as well. And we're going to move to our last segment now, which is Brad Recommends.
The latest tips, tricks, and tools you can use today. This is Brad Recommends on Taming the High Cost of College.
Today on Brad Recommends, I'm going to recommend a fellow podcast. There's a podcast out there called How to Pay for College HQ. It's hosted by Celeste Horton. I had the pleasure of meeting Celeste while I was in Las Vegas at a conference about podcasting and blogging, and we hit it off. We talked quite a bit. She actually interviewed me for one of her episodes, and hopefully in the future I will interview her as well. She is a mother of three who's going through the college process and is trying to figure it all out. And what she's doing is she's interviewing one expert every week that she runs across and looks up online and so forth. So she's interviewed, myself on financial planning and authors about scholarships and other ways to pay for college and all kinds of great interviews. So there's 23 interviews of 23 different experts that are already out there. So if you consume a lot of podcasts and you're looking for more college-related stuff that will give you more information and in addition to what you're learning from me, feel free to go check out her podcast. Again, it's How to Pay for College HQ. It's available in iTunes and Stitcher, as is this podcast, which of course is tamingthehighcostofcollege.com, available in iTunes and Stitcher as well. So check out both of those podcasts. With that, I am going to wrap things up. I appreciate you guys taking the time to listen. I am starting to get a little bit of feedback from people who are appreciating what I'm doing, so I appreciate the feedback as well. I'm glad to hear that people are out there listening. That's all for now, and we'll see you again in a week or so. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Taming the High Cost of College podcast. Now it's time for you to take action. Head to tamingthehighcostofcollege.com for show notes, bonus content, and to leave feedback for Brad. The next step on your college journey starts now.
Brad Baldridge is a registered representative of Cambridge Investment Research and an investment advisor representative of Cambridge Investment Research Advisors, a registered investment advisor. Securities are offered through Cambridge Investment Research Incorporated, a broker-dealer and member of FINRA and SIPC. Brad owns two companies, Baldridge Wealth Management and Baldridge College Solutions. The Baldridge companies are not affiliated with Cambridge Investment Research.